知識論嘅形而上學第15講，我哋講到 presuppositions 預設嘅問題。咁大家咧可能聽到頭都暈埋下，就係話咧預設呢個詞咧係指 a priori， 至少喺歷史上係同呢個概念有關嘅。但事實上咧，宇宙裏面冇咩特別純粹嘅 a priori 獨立於經驗嘅知識，又要管理知識嘅噃。亦都冇純粹嘅 a posteriori 嘅，因為所有我哋所經歷過嘅嘢咧，都係神事先已經解釋過，事先已經預定同埋了解㗎。好啦，咁講咗咁多啊，咁究竟a Fantil 係一個 presupposition 係咩意思咧？咁好啦，我哋而家開始講第14個 point。In what sense Fantil is a presuppositionalist? However, Fantil can be called a presuppositionalist in another sense. 但係咧，從另外一個意義上嚟講咧，我哋可以話 Fantil 係一個預設主義者㗎。佢毫無疑問嘅相信神嘅啟示係所有人類思維嘅絕對權威，亦都係優先於人類嘅思維㗎。God's revelation has absolute authority over all human thought, and thus has a certain priority over all human thought. 我哋已經睇到佢嘅類比知識analogical knowledge 要求我哋要效法上帝嘅思維而思維㗎。We must think God's thoughts after Him. 根據范第爾嘅觀點咧 ，revelation must serve as the ultimate criterion of truth in all areas of life. 根據范第爾咧，喺我哋生命中所有嘅範圍裏邊，啟示都必須係終極嘅、最高嘅真理準則嚟㗎。This revelation is given to us a priori in a sense. 從一個意義上嚟講咧，神嘅啟示係 a priori 先驗嘅賜俾我哋㗎。It governs our interpretation of experience. 因為神所俾我哋啟示咧，係管理我哋點樣去解釋我哋嘅經驗㗎。And that is one traditional function of a priori knowledge. 而呢個當然就係 a priori 先驗知識其中一個傳統上嘅要扮演嘅功能㗎。But we discover it partly through our experience.Unlike a priori knowledge in a traditional sense， 但我哋咧點樣認識到神嘅啟示呢？一部分係透過我哋嘅經驗㗎。咁咧，從傳統嘅先驗知識就有啲唔同㗎。We learn about God by reading the Bible, by observing His handiwork in creation and in ourselves。我哋點樣學習認識神呢？我哋讀聖經啦，喺聖靈嘅光照之下讀聖經，亦都係觀察到神所創造宇宙嘅大功，同埋睇我哋自己身上神嘅大功㗎。That is, we receive revelation through experience. 我哋係透過經驗去領受神嘅啟示嘅。This is why Fantil is able to draw up a sharp contrast between a priori reasoning and basing ourselves upon the revelation of God. 所以頭先我哋聽過其中一段話咧 ，Fantil 就話咧，純粹嘅先驗推理同埋我哋服喺神啟示之下係完全唔同嘅。So we may or may not choose to call Fantil a presuppositionalist. 所以你叫唔叫阿 Fantil 做前提派都可以嘅。But it is more important in either case to understand in what ways Fantil affirms and in what ways he rejects traditional a prioriism. 但更重要嘅就係我哋要了解到阿 Fantil 喺咩意義上係承認傳統嘅 a prioriism 先驗主義，喺咩意義上咧係拒絕承認傳統嘅 a prioriism 先驗主義㗎。第二段 The meaning of presupposition 預設嘅意義。Fantil uses the term presupposition to indicate the role that God's revelation ought to play in human thought. Fantil 用呢個字 presupposition 預設咧，去指出神嘅啟示喺人嘅思想裏面應該扮演咩角色㗎 ？I do not believe that he ever defines the term. 阿 Frame 話咧，可能范體從來冇為預設下一個定義㗎。I have tried to define it for him. 阿 Frame 話咁等我嚟做一個定義咧。A basic heart commitment 預設就係一個基本上心中的堅持或者係委身。For a Christian, that commitment is to God.As he reveals himself in his word， 對基督徒嚟講，佢最基本嘅堅持就係委身於神，即係嗰位喺佢話語裏邊自我啟示嘅神。Non-Christians substitute something else。非基督徒呢，佢揾另外一樣嘢去取代神，作為佢心中嘅堅持㗎。Another God， 另外一個神明呢 ，themselves 或者係佢自己咯。Pleasure, money, rationality， 歡樂、金錢、理性等等。As that to which they are ultimately committed, and that which governs all of life, including thought。佢哋係至終係委身堅持嗰樣嘢㗎，嗰樣嘢係管理佢哋人生嘅所有部分，包括思想㗎。Our ultimate commitment plays an important role in our knowledge。我哋心中嘅堅持，我哋嘅委身呢，對我哋嘅知識係好重要嘅，扮演好重要嘅角色㗎。It determines our ultimate criteria of truth and falsity, right and wrong。因為我哋心中所堅持嘅對象呢，就決定我哋喺判斷真假是非嗰個最高嘅準則係乜嘢。As long as we consistently maintain our ultimate commitment, we cannot accept anything as true or right that conflicts with that commitment。只要我哋好徹底嘅堅持我哋所堅持嘅，咁我哋就唔會接受一啲呢與我哋呢個堅持矛盾嘅，作為係真理或者係對嘅。Unbeliever unconsciously concede God exists in a different presupposition。好啦，咁呢個就係我哋對 presupposition 呢個字嘅定義。不過呢 presupposition 有第二個用法嘅噃。喺繁體字嘅著作裏邊呢，有少數地方係用另外一個方法去用 presupposition 呢個字㗎。譬如話佢會勸告護教傳福音基督徒呢，應該向非基督徒表明，就算當佢哋否認上帝嘅實質嘅時候，佢哋依然真實嘅預設上帝㗎。佢話嗰啲非基督徒啊 ，Even in his virtual negation of God, he is still really presupposing God。好明顯㗎。當非基督徒喺咁樣嘅意義上預設神嘅時候呢，佢唔係承認神係佢生命至終嘅委身嘅對象。Van Til喺呢度嘅論點就係話呢，非基督徒藉著佢假設宇宙可以被理解啊，咁樣去默認咗佢所否認嘅神。呢個係預設嘅次要嘅意義。In assuming the intelligibility of the world, the unbeliever implicitly concedes the existence of God that he explicitly denies。非基督徒佢明文嘅否認神嘅存在嘅，但佢默認咗神，因為佢認為宇宙可以被理解㗎。呢個係 the lesser sense of presuppose， 係預設嘅一個比較次要嘅意思。Is related to Van Til's more common use of the term， 同繁體前面嗰個比較通常嘅用法係有關係 ，but it's somewhat different， 係有唔同。For the unbeliever to presuppose God in this context， 喺咁樣嘅情況之下，一個非基督徒默認上帝、預設上帝呢 ，is for him to think, say or do something contrary to his own inclination。嘅意思就係話呢，非基督徒喺咁嘅層次上預設上帝係違背佢自己嘅意願㗎。And that indicates at some level of his consciousness a recognition of God's reality and significance。所以呢，喺佢嘅心裏邊，佢嘅意識嘅某一個層次上呢，佢係承認神係真嘅，係重要㗎。咁呢個第二個用法 presupposition 嘅第二個用法。Number 3， 第三種嘅用法 presupposing things， 預設一啲嘅事物。That means a necessary condition， 即係一個必須嘅條件。另外有啲嘅 Van Til 嘅著作裏邊咧，佢都用 presuppose 嗰個字，唔係 presuppose 人或者位格，係 presuppose 嘢㗎。譬如話 arguments， 佢預設一啲嘅論證 ；methods 方法 ；knowledge 佢預設某一種嘅知識 ；academic disciplines 學術嘅學科 ；states of affairs 狀態，例如宇宙可以被理解咁樣嘅狀態。In such contexts, that which is presupposed is a necessary condition, or that which legitimizes。所以佢哋所謂佢哋預設嘅呢，係一個必須嘅條件，或者係使之合法化嘅。Perhaps we can relate these uses to a basic definition by saying， 或者我哋可以咁樣講 ：If X presupposes Y, then Y is that to which a person must be committed if he is to give an intelligent account of X。假如 X 係預設咗 Y 嘅話呢，咁一個人呢 就必須堅持 Y。假如佢要對 X 有合理嘅解釋，必須要有 Y 先至可以合理解釋 X 嘅。第4種用法 presupposition synonyms 預設呢個詞嘅同義詞。有時呢 Van Til 會用其他嘅字去表達同預設相同嘅意義嘅，特別係 starting point 起始點 reference point 參考點。阿 Frame 就話呢啲名詞比較冇咁清楚，特別係 starting point 起點，因為佢含有時間次序嘅開始嘅意思。我已經睇到呢個唔係預設必須要有嘅意思嚟㗎。presuppose 嘅第5方面嘅意思 reasoning by presupposition 預設式嘅推理 Van Til's transcendental argument 范特爾為基督教信仰所作出嘅超驗論證。Finally, there is the phrase reasoning by presupposition 最後 Van Til 嗰個嘅預設性嘅推理 reasoning by presupposition Van Til designates the transcendental argument for Christian theism in this way 范特爾係指佢對基督教嘅超驗論證。Because he advocates this sort of argument, Van Til may certainly in one sense be called a presuppositionalist 因為范特爾提倡咁一種嘅超驗論證，所以佢喺某一種嘅意義上佢係一個預設主義者。We shall discuss this form of argumentation in chapter 23。我哋喺本書第23章呢會討論呢一種嘅論證嘅。第3段 Some misunderstandings 某一些對預設嘅誤會。有啲作者呢，例如 Mark Hanna、R.C. Sproul 等等呢，佢會將預設誤解為 mere supposition， 只係人所認為嘅 assumption 假設 postulate 假設 a belief chosen arbitrarily with no rational basis， 即係冇理性根據嘅一種嘅好隨意選用嘅假設。This is not Van Til's understanding, and it should not be assumed in discussions about him。假設唔係范特爾對預設嘅理解，所以我哋討論 Van Til 嘅時候呢，我哋唔可以假設預設呢個詞係指假設咁。For Van Til, Christian presuppositions have the strongest possible rational ground, namely the revelation of God。對 Van Til 嚟講呢，基督徒嘅預設呢係有最強烈嘅理性根據嘅，即係話呢係有上帝嘅啟示作為根據嘅。Indeed, Christian presuppositions are even provable, in a sense, as we shall see in our examination of Van Til's argument for Christianity。當我哋喺本書嘅 Argument for Christianity 對基督教嘅論證嗰一章嘅時候呢，我哋睇到啦 Van Til 認為呢基督徒嘅預設呢，甚至乎係可以被證明嘅。Nor does Van Til use presupposition to refer to a hypothesis adapted for consideration, as does, for example, Edward J. Carnell。另外，預設亦都唔係為咗思考而採用嘅假説 hypothesis 呢個雖然咧係阿 Carnell 有咁樣嘅預設嘅定義，但係對范特爾嚟講咧 presuppositions are categorical not hypothetical。預設係絕對嘅 categorical 嘅，唔係假設嘅 hypothetical 嘅。E.J. Carnell 咧係Fuller 神學院一段時期嘅院長，後尾因為食咗安眠藥太多咧係去世，之後咧就請咗 David Hubbard 做院長嘅。Nor should we emphasize the in presupposition to suggest that a presupposition must be held at some point in time prior to all other knowledge。我哋都唔應該過分強調 presupposition 嗰個 pre 預設個預字呢，唔好過分嘅強調佢，以免暗示預設必須喺時間上係早過所有其他知識嘅。預設嗰個預字係指至最即係最尊貴嘅最高嘅 preeminence 咁嘅意思嘅，與其他信念比較係最尊貴最高咁嘅意思。Van Til 話：人對自我嘅意識、對事物嘅意識係預設咗神嘅自我意識同埋自我同埋事物本身嘅可理解性格。Van Til 話：Man's consciousness of self and of objects presuppose for the intelligibility the self-consciousness of God。人之所以可以理解自己、理解事物， 係因為呢神嘅自我意識，所以呢佢嘅人嘅自我意識同埋人對事物嘅意識係可以被理解咁。In asserting this, we are not thinking of psychological and temporal priority。呢方面我哋唔係講緊時間上更早，亦都唔係心理上。We are thinking only of the question as to what is the final reference point in interpretation。咁我哋只不過諗緊一個問題，就係喺對事物嘅詮釋嘅時候，至終嘅參考點係乜嘢？ The question is sometimes asked, how can people be expected to presuppose God's revelation before they come to believe in God？ 好啦，最後喺呢一段最後呢，Frame 就處理一個問題，佢話：當人仲未嚟信上帝嘅時候，你點可以要求佢係預設咗神嘅啟示呢？回答：第一 ，Everyone knows God already by virtue of natural revelation。每一個人都因為自然啟示係認識咗神㗎。Those who choose not to believe in Him do so contrary to their own better knowledge。所以一個人假如唔信神嘅話呢，佢係違背咗自己最可靠嘅知識，去選擇話佢唔認識神㗎。第二 ，Even if presupposing God did require knowledge in addition to what we have, the lack of such knowledge would not invalidate the obligation to presuppose God。就算我哋現有嘅知識係唔足夠讓我哋預設上帝，亦都唔能夠免除我哋有呢個義務去預設上帝㗎。Rather, that obligation would entail the further obligation to gain that additional knowledge。事實上就係因為我哋有預設上帝嘅義務，所以更有義務去尋找尚未得着嘅知識咯。第三 ，Even if the requirement to presuppose God's revelation were in some sense impossible for man to obey， 就算喺某一種意義上，人係不可能遵行呢個預設上帝呢項嘅要求 ，that fact would not invalidate it。咁樣嘅不能呢，係唔會消減呢個要求嘅合理性㗎。Calvinism typically teaches that God commands what depraved man cannot do apart from grace。加爾文主義嘅典型嘅教導就係話，倘若冇恩典嘅話，上帝所吩咐嘅嘢，墮落嘅人一件都做唔到嘅。最後第四段 ，proximate and ultimate presuppositions。喺前邊幾段裏邊，我哋已經將預設嘅定義澄清為一個人心裏邊嘅終極嘅堅持，而非基督徒對神嘅預設係一種例外嘅用法。第一種例外，第二種嘅例外，既然啦理所當然嘅人嘅意識係次要嘅起始點，咁神就永遠係人類解釋中最基本、最終極嘅參考點。人係 proximate starting point， 神係 final reference point。有人抗議就話啦，我哋唔能夠要求人喺佢思維裏邊預設上帝，或者以上帝為起點㗎，因為佢哋必須以最接近佢哋嘅事物做開始，即係佢自己嘅意識、佢自己嘅心智做開始點㗎。當我哋用阿 Fantil 嘅 starting point 呢個觀念嘅時候，呢種抗議嘅說服力就減低咗啦。因為 Fantil 嘅 starting point 呢，唔係時間上嘅開始，係指一個人生命中最高嘅權威。我哋假如認為預設嘅問題係指時間上更早，咁呢任何事物都可以做我哋嘅起點㗎。即係我哋同人傳福音從咩開始講都得㗎。事實上我哋嘅思想內容嘅先後次序唔重要㗎。更重要係咩呢？就算我哋真係以自己嘅心智意識為開始，我哋依然唔能夠對自己嘅意識有正確嘅理解，因為我哋已經離開咗上帝，認為自己係自主㗎。誠然㗎，對自己嘅意識嘅真正嘅洞見，一定會引我哋去到上帝嘅面前，因為我哋係神嘅形象。所以加爾文強調，對神嘅認識同埋對自己認識之間係相互依賴㗎。因此，就算喺時間上呢，真正與自己嘅意識相遇嘅時候，亦都係與上帝相遇嘅時候。就算我哋必須喺時間上以自己嘅意識做出發點，都唔表示我哋必須要接受意識所提供嘅當時嘅標準，作為我哋嘅規範性準則嘅 normative criterion。時間上嘅先後次序同埋規範性係兩個唔同嘅問題。起始點 starting point 可能會帶嚟混亂。所以呢個唔係預設最好嘅同義詞。Fantil 嘅講法係人嘅自我 self 或者人嘅意識 consciousness is the proximate starting point， 係次要嘅起點或者次要嘅預設，神先係終極嘅預設嚟㗎。我哋知道自己嘅意識㗎，我哋都必須預設咁樣嘅自我意識，先可以認識其他嘢㗎。無論如何，我哋終極嘅預設必須係神，神必須係我哋唯一嘅預設。使徒正係預設咗咁嘅關係，所以佢話：我哋嘅心若責備我哋，神比我哋嘅心更大。一切事冇咩佢唔知道㗎。好，到呢度呢，我哋就講完咗預設嘅問題 presuppositions 呢個 chapter。